September the 11th attacks. How did they change the world? In the interview, historian Bernd Greiner.
Mr. Greiner, you've written a book about September the 11th, that momentous day, and you've tried to describe the fear and the consequences of that day. How did you experience it at the time?
Like most people, I couldn't believe it. I was very concerned about a friend visiting New York, but thank God nothing happened to him. But my first impressions were shock and disbelief that something like that was possible.
It's impossible to forget the force and intensity of the images of September the 11th. We all think it was an epoch-making event. As a historian, do you agree?
We will only be able to judge that in a few years or decades, when we take a closer look at it. Now, after 10 years, we can say that it was more than just an isolated event. As many American observers say, it triggered a constitutional crisis. In Europe, to some extent, it undermined the rule of law. It brought fear back into public life. We will have to deal with all these things for many years to come, and international terrorism is by no means a spent force. It's a process that will probably last more than a generation, if not longer.
You've already indicated that September the 11th changed the world. If you had to characterize it with one term, what is the most important characteristic? What term would you choose?
Democratic crisis, and also a meltdown of the rule of law.
And fear as the predominant sentiment of society?
Fear is, so to speak, the bedrock from which these two processes originate. Fear is always the worst counsel for politicians. Many governments allowed themselves to make fear a part of their policies, and failed at the main business of politics, at least what it should be in democratic societies. That is, calming emotions, stepping back and having a rational discourse. Instead, they stirred up emotions and instrumentalized fear, especially the Bush administration.
In your book, you say you believe and can prove that September the 11th was a welcome opportunity for George W. Bush and his government to invade Iraq. Does that mean that this way or that, you think they were justified in going to war?
Presumably, they wouldn't have invaded Iraq without September the 11th. Prior to that, it was a problem that was relatively low on the foreign policy agenda. But 9/11 opened a window of opportunity, and the US tried to use the Iraq war to demonstrate a new geopolitical credibility. There was an attempt to demonstrate military assertiveness, and above all, they followed a strategy called "scare the Muslim." In other words, to intimidate the Muslim world, so it would never again be even tempted to support terrorist groups, let alone a terrorist attack on the US. It was also a game of playing with fear against the backdrop of the decision to go to war in Iraq.
Right after September the 11th, the Allies, including Germany, pledged absolute solidarity with the US. That was certainly to some extent controversial, but for many a matter of course. Gerhard Schröder has recently confirmed that. Looking back, it seems astonishing that the Americans tried to do everything without their allies.
Exactly. Allies were relatively unimportant to them. They gladly accepted this talk of absolute solidarity as political currency that enhanced their own status, but basically they were not at all interested in other countries taking part in their military operations. Rumsfeld even said that others would only get in the way. The US wanted to demonstrate what a superpower could do on its own.
NATO even invoked its emergency articles and called for mutual assistance, but NATO wasn't used either.
NATO wasn't used. The Americans accepted the coalition of the willing as political backing and as proof and acknowledgement of their own decision, their own course. But militarily and strategically, it wasn't necessary.
Was it the US government's effort to show it was the last great military and probably political superpower in the world?
It was a clear calculation to demonstrate we can do what we want to and we will achieve our aim irrespective of objections or criticism from third parties. Whoever's with us, fine. But even if the entire world is against us, we will continue with this course. That was the core of the demonstration of power. It's more than unilateralism. It was a clear political message to friend and foe.
Das ist mehr als Unilateralismus. Das ist sozusagen eine klare politische Botschaft an Freund wie an Feind.
Today, the Afghanistan war has reached a dead end. Talks are being held with those who were supposed to have been defeated. All agree the Iraq war was a disaster. During the Iraq war, did all moral and political standards of the West and really the Americans vanish?
Many standards were lost, especially the reintroduction of torture in Iraq, Afghanistan and other theatres of war, which caused immense damage. Abu Ghraib and other torture chambers were no coincidence. They were not caused by any interrogation specialists who overdid it. They were the product of targeted policies ordered from above. And as a result, they caused immense and long-term damage to moral standards and the integrity of their society.
At the beginning of this interview, you said that September the 11th was a shock for us, and we reacted with almost disbelief. But I think we all had this extraordinary sympathy and empathy for the Americans. One has to fear that the reactions led us to think that there's a wedge between the Americans and their real friends. Did their reactions cause them to lose the sympathy very soon after that?
The Bush administration certainly squandered the goodwill very quickly. Within a few months, everything changed. Think about the massive demonstrations ahead of the Iraq war all across Europe, in Berlin, Madrid, London, Paris. It wasn't anti-Americanism, as it's commonly labelled, but rather sheer dismay over the politics of that government. But it also changed the image of America, and not for the better.
Das Amerika-Bild verändert und nicht zum Guten verändert.
Then is the American people's animosity towards politics also a consequence of September the 11th?
There are good reasons to see it that way. After all, after September the 11th, a lot of things in US politics were thrown off balance. This is now a very fearful society, and this political division is possibly a delayed consequence of this development. The emotionalization of politics, the unwillingness to compromise, the dogmatism, the enhanced status of the conservative wing that thinks everything that differs from their core beliefs is the work of the devil. These are the aftershocks of 9/11.
Mr. Greiner, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.